Do you have any strategies or any advice on how you build that trust to get people who might be uncomfortable sharing to start sharing with you?
Yeah, I mean, I like to give people the option to not share because I think that itself makes them feel more trustworthy. Like, I know it sounds kind of counterintuitive, but if you say, I totally understand if you don't want to share this piece of information, this is, especially when it comes to something like voting, right? I am a firm believer that like what you do in the voting booth is your choice and it shouldn't have to be public. And so I always give people the chance to opt out of sharing information in an interview with me. Like I'll say something like, this is totally up to you if you want to share this. I understand if you don't. And then I ask them if they're willing to, right? And so I really like to hedge in allowing people if to the choice to be vulnerable. And I think that alone can be helpful in building trust because then people can understand like, oh, she's not just out to get the information or just out to get me, right? And then I think like what's really helpful, and this is something maybe we'll come back to as we talk a bit more, but like I think asking people to share a story can sometimes be easier than asking people like a hard hitting, disclose to me your most intense political belief, right?
Mhm.
Like asking someone like, tell me about a time where you felt conflicted about something with politics, or tell me about a time where someone reacted really negatively to something that you said. Like storytelling is really helpful for many, many, many different reasons. But for one, once someone does it, when someone engages in a storytelling, like tells a story to you, that can kind of break down barriers and open and like lead to some more openness in the conversation. And then if I am hopefully as a reader, I'm good at responding and I respond in an affirmative way. Thank you so much for telling me that. Oh, that's so interesting. Can you tell me more about this? That they don't feel shut down. And then that does create that trust. So sometimes I'll open my interviews with like a question about their childhood, which
Okay.
sounds like kind of crazy, but I'll like, go through some of the first questions. Then I'll say something like, can you talk to me about kind of what were your parents like? Did they like politics? Was this something that was brought up a lot? And then that feels a little bit less high stakes because it's not as much about them, it's about their parent. And then I learn about their parents, and then that's kind of a intimate thing to share. And then they feel more open to talk about other things. So there are ways to kind of like orient or layer questions in a way that induce that openness and
Mhm.
trust. And one of the ways you can do that is through storytelling and asking people to share stories, because that is a very fundamental human experience, to tell a story and to hear a story.
Yeah, something else that you mentioned that I connected to something else. I just became a mentor for junior high students. I went to the mentoring training,
Mhm.
and they talk about the value of asking what and not why. So instead of
Mm.
asking students like, "Oh, why did that happen?" ask your mentee what happened. Because when you ask the why, they get to a defensive place.
Mhm.
So I was thinking about the what as like a storytelling venue. So like, tell me what happened is more framing that into the story side. So very,
Yeah,
very
yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, yeah. And then there's not a right or wrong, right? Like why feels like there is a right or wrong and I'm grilling you, right? And what is it's your experience, you tell me, right?
Yeah. So something I want to do as we finish this episode is about asking you how to translate these skills into the classroom setting. So I know you also teach different classes on campus. So how do you take what you have learned in your research and your interviews into training your students to be able to do these things and also engaging your students in potentially divisive or hard conversations?
Yeah. So there are a few ways that I do this. I, as you might expect, I really value storytelling and question asking. And so I try to kind of make those central to whatever class I'm teaching. So, for instance, in the question asking, I want my students to walk out of my class and be like, oh, I learned what a good question is, and I learned how to phrase a good question. And so, for my larger class, that's part lecture, part discussion. I have each student submit discussion questions. So I try and provide assignments that don't ask my students to necessarily take a stand on something, but ask them to ask good questions about something. So for that class, it's they each submit, they sign up for a time of their choice. They get to pick the topic, and then they submit at least 3 discussion questions for the class to talk about. And so they submit discussion questions the night before, and then in the morning I look at the questions and drink my coffee, and then I put them in. I pick out some of the best ones, and then I put them into our presentation for the day. And then those serve as the source or the questions that kind of prompt our discussion at the end of class. And what I like about that process is, one, it's connected to the reading, and it's clearly connected to the topic for the class. And so they get a chance to learn how to ask good evaluative questions about the topic that we're talking about that day. And it gives them ownership over the discussion, right? Because they're the ones who are putting forth what we're going to talk about, not me. And so they're way more motivated to have the conversation when it's their peer who asks the question rather than me. And that is really good. In my smaller class, I have them serve as discussion leaders for one day. So they have to fill out and serve as the person who kind of guides the discussion around the reading. And I ask them to kind of pitch different types of questions. They learn what different question stems are for evaluative questions, for application questions, right? And so they learn the different styles of questions that you can ask. And again, with the hope that when they leave my class, they take that ability to ask different types of questions and good questions in other settings. So for questions, I really try and make as much as I can about assignments in the class to be around prompting questions, not just having them write an essay where they give me their, thesis and they debate and defend their stance, right? And then for the storytelling, I actually took this from the Institute for Citizens and Scholars. They taught us this, but I have them do what's called like mini storytelling. So they'll do like one student serves as the storyteller. They'll be in like pairs of 3 or groups of 3. So one student is the storyteller, one of them is the listener, and then one of them is the timer. And so they'll set a 2-minute timer, and each person who's serving as the storyteller has to answer a question like, I think I did this one the other day with my class, was what was the last time you felt like an outsider? And what led you to feel this way? How did others make you feel in that setting? And so they have 2 minutes to share their story, and then they share their story with the listener, and then they rotate until each person has a chance to be the storyteller. And what I like about that is that like there's a lot of research in neuroscience to say that when we listen to stories, it like activates our limbic system, which increases our oxytocin and our dopamine. And both of those are hormones that lead to empathy. And so when we have people share, just listening to a story can lead us to feel more connected with others. And it can be really helpful, particularly in smaller classes where you're going to have students do some of these more smaller group discussions, or you're wanting a lot more investment or interaction between students. It can kind of break down some of those walls to allow them to make connections. And I like to do something where I have the question for the mini storytelling be related to the class. So that day we were talking about polarization and how we have in-groups and out-groups in polarization. And so that was like kind of an orienting question for them for the topic of the day. So those are some of the ways that I do try and prioritize the things that I know can help with conversations across lines of difference, the storytelling and the question asking. And I try and weave those in throughout the semester.
Yeah, so I do have an extra question about this. So let's say I want to do this, like I want to start like having my students like create some questions so they can guide the discussions in the class. Do you have any like hints? Like as I mentioned before the recording, like I'm a chemist, so this is a little bit outside my comfort zone. Um, is there any like components that I should be paying attention to when students submit like their questions? So like, do you have any suggestions about like, hey, make sure that the questions have these components or they are this way? And I know there are different types of questions, but just in general to get started about asking students, and maybe I get 20 questions like, what do you use to like prioritize them?
Yeah, I like to build an intensity of the question, right? So like some questions are going to be a bit more like, you know, how did the person like more comprehension type questions, right? Like, how did the author of the piece that we're reading define this? Or how might we think about this concept, right? Which is a little bit more like here, not to get all full like teacher, but like Bloom's taxonomy, right?
Yes, I was thinking about
Right? It's like you want to build in this taxonomy level. Like much
Yeah.
in that same way, you might think about structuring questions, right? Like a progression, if you will. like from comprehension to evaluation to application. And so like you want people to maybe start with a lower level question where it's an easier access point for them to talk about it, move on to something that's a little bit more evaluative to the final, which might be an application question about how could we implement this strategy and blah blah blah, right? So that flow can be really helpful.
I love this. Like this is a very good transition and connection between like your work, civil discourse, course design, Bloom's
Yeah.
taxonomy. This is fantastic.
I know. I know. I didn't think I was ever gonna have to say Bloom's taxonomy ever again, and I did. I brought that.
Thank you. Thank you. This is a great pitch for CITL resources. So
There you
fantastic.
go.
Yeah. Oh, this is great. Thank you. I learned a lot about what you're doing, and I'm actually excited to continue to work with you and learn more because your work is so important, especially at this time where like social media and algorithms keep dividing people, and we need to learn how to create like develop the skills not only on us but in our students, so they can actually engage in these conversations and lead with curiosity, so they can learn how to close those gaps. So huge thank
Yes.
you.
Yes, you're so welcome. I'm happy to do it.
And before we close, what's the title of the book that you're working on?
Yep. So the book will be out hopefully by this fall. It's called Hearts Divided: How Politics Shape Our Closest Connections.
If you want to learn more about this, please stay tuned for that book and read it. I know it's gonna be fantastic. If we learn this in just like 10, 15 minutes, imagine how much you can learn through reading this book.
Yes. Excellent book.
Thank you. And as always, remember that teaching goes beyond what's on the syllabus. So thank you for listening.